And as President Xi begins his Vietnam visit, he warns that protectionism leads to nowhere. And he insists that Beijing and Hanoi should safeguard the multilateral trading system. For more on Mr. Xi's Southeast Asia tour, let's speak to Enze Han, who is Associate Professor of Politics and Public Administration at the University of Hong Kong. Professor Han, it's good to see you. First up, let's pick up on the president's words ahead of his meetings in Hanoi. Protectionism leads to nowhere. That's telling of the purpose of his tour, isn't it, Professor?
Right, and because the thing is, China and Vietnam, and as well as ASEAN in general, has been integrating their trading relations during the past decade, right? And Vietnam is China's larger trading partner in Southeast Asia. So much of the, let's say, the tariffs on China during the first Trump administration has witnessed a surge of Chinese exports to Vietnam, either through further processing in Vietnam or through the process so-called transshipment via Vietnam to US or beyond. So I think in some ways, a free trading relations between China and Southeast Asia has been very beneficial, for both sides. And so that's why I think Beijing really tried to find some common ground between itself and also Vietnam, Malaysia, and Cambodia in terms of how to find a best strategy to push back against the bullying acts from the U.S.
Okay, so let's focus on Vietnam first, since it's his first stop. You talk about the largesse of their trade. Vietnam, their trade with China last year was at least $160 billion. That's massive. And President Xi is still courting in Hanoi. What is he looking at? What else can he offer them? And is this value then at risk?
Well, I mean, there are lots of things China can offer, right? First of all, in a way that currently, even though the trading volume, bilateral trading volume between China and Vietnam is very high, but also quite a lot of supply chains still remain in China, right? Which means that the trading relations require ongoing cooperation, because Vietnam cannot necessarily produce every aspect of the supply chain within itself yet, right? And that is basically kind of the reality. And on the other hand, I think politically, Beijing has, particularly in terms of, let's say, its strategies within South China Sea, right? I mean, that's why it has emphasized the need for cooperation, dialogue, negotiation. So that probably indicates China is willing to make certain concessions on those political issues to seek Vietnamese cooperation.
And there's also Malaysia in this tour list, Professor. We know that Prime Minister Anwar Ibrahim, he's made China a priority. Plus, of course, his country chairs ASEAN this year. So he'll likely have an ambitious agenda with President Xi. What do you think is on it?
So Malaysia's relation with China are in a much better ground in comparison with Vietnam, right? So which means that the Malaysian government has been siding with China quite firmly on quite a few foreign policy issues, and as well as praising China for its contribution for Southeast Asia development, and etc. Right. So I think on that ground, I think both governments see eye to eye on many common values and interests, particularly regarding American foreign policy in the Middle East and towards Gaza, and etc. So I think in Malaysia's context, I think cooperation between Beijing and Kuala Lumpur is actually much easier to achieve than perhaps in Vietnam.
And talk to us about ASEAN's dilemma in welcoming President Xi, because the countries, of course, want the benefits of doing business, but they're very cautious at the same time about its growing influence in the region, maritime and otherwise.
Right. So obviously, China has ongoing territorial disputes with Vietnam and also with Philippines, and as well as Malaysia, etc. Right. So I think that kind of general concerns of Beijing's aggressiveness in terms of its territorial disputes. But on the other hand, I think in general, states in the region, their views on China has improved significantly during the past couple of years. And I think that partly has been reflected in terms of the whimsical changes in American foreign policy. So in some sense, we can think about, relations between Southeast Asia and China, right? I mean, even though China has ongoing issues with Southeast Asia, but overall, Beijing's policies have been relatively stable, right? So in that sense, it's much easier to deal with a relatively stable foreign policy from China rather than dealing with a whimsical sort of U.S. foreign policy that can change overnight. And so I think that kind of perspective will probably be much more important in influencing regional governments in their ways of dealing with both Beijing and Washington.
But stability aside, how do you suppose China can manage their peacemaker diplomacy with their ambitions amid these flashpoints that we see in the South China Sea?
So I think Beijing probably can do is to de-escalate, right? In particular, recent years, we've seen, recent months even, right, seen certain relatively aggressive tactics towards the Philippines in terms of maritime patrol and etc. So then perhaps that means China can stop doing some of those things towards the Philippines. Similarly, with regard to Vietnam, and there's also room for cooperation. Let's say, for example, in terms of exploring the maritime resources, and such as in terms of the natural gas and oil, etc. So that means co-development, right? In a way that to share the resources in the region rather than using military means to solve those disputes. And I think that's probably the way forward.
Interesting suggestions there. Well, thank you very much. We're speaking with Enze Han, who's Associate Professor of Politics and Public Administration at the University of Hong Kong.